In 1988, there were literally millions of Americans who genuinely, entirely believed the world was going to end.
Oh, yeah. Like absolute certainty.
Right. And they hadn't just, vaguely guessed this. They had done the math.
Yep. Prophetic math.
Exactly. They had mapped out the Soviet Union, the Middle East, the founding of the State of Israel, the Book of Revelation, and they set a literal countdown clock.
It's wild to look back on.
It is. You have people maxing out their credit cards, abandoning their long-term plans, just waiting for the sky to crack open.
Because why save for retirement if the rapture's on Tuesday? Right?
Exactly. But here is the truly wild part for me. When 1988 actually came and went and, the world didn't end, the movement didn't die.
No, not at all.
It didn't fade away into obscurity. It actually gained momentum, which is crazy. It completely rewired American pop culture and then eventually took over the foreign policy of the most powerful nation on earth.
It is honestly one of the most stunning sociological and political pivots in modern history.
Yeah.
I mean, you go from this fringe apocalyptic prediction to a geopolitical juggernaut, one that literally dictates terms in Washington, London, and Jerusalem.
And that is exactly what we are wading into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
So today, we're spending our time unpacking a really sprawling, highly provocative document. It was published in 2025, and it's titled Zion's Shadow: How Christian Zionism Distorted the Message of Christ.
Authored by Tony Yustein.
Tony Yustein. And the core mission of this deep dive for you listening today is to explore this thesis that Christian Zionism took the original gospel, which was fundamentally this message of peace, humility, universal grace, and mutated it.
Mutated it into a militaristic geopolitical ideology.
Exactly. We're going to track how this super obscure theological idea moved from 19th century footnotes straight into the modern Oval Office.
But before we even touch the history, we really have to address the elephant in the room regarding this specific source text.
Oh, we absolutely do, because if you pick up this book, within the first few pages, you are hit with something that is, well, it's not your standard academic opener.
Definitely not.
The author, Tony Yustein, claims to be the reincarnated vessel of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes.
And not just Jesus. He also claims to be the reincarnation of the ancient Egyptian scribe Thoth, the angelic voice Metatron, and wait for it, Nikola Tesla.
It is a profoundly eccentric, mystical framing device.
That's a polite way of putting it.
Right, and for a lot of readers, that right there is just a full stop. They close the book.
Honestly, I don't blame them. How on earth are we supposed to engage with a text that claims the guy who invented alternating current and the guy who gave the Sermon on the Mount are like sharing a consciousness to write a critique of Middle Eastern geopolitics?
It's a completely fair hurdle.
Yeah.
But here is why we are looking at this and really how we're approaching it today.
Okay.
If you set aside that mystical, highly unconventional prologue.
Which is hard to do, but okay.
Right, but if you do, the actual body of the text, like the vast majority of these hundreds of pages, is a deeply researched, methodical, historical critique.
Yeah, that surprised me.
It traces documented historical figures, actual past legislation, real-world theological shifts, and actual military conflicts.
Right. Once you get past the Tesla of it all, the substance of the critique relies really heavily on historical record.
Exactly. The evolution of biblical translation, political science, all of it.
Okay, so it's grounded in real stuff.
It is.
Ah.
And because we are diving into that history today, I need to lay down a very strict, crystal clear baseline for our conversation.
Yes, please do. This is important.
The material we are exploring contains incredibly charged content. It deals directly with the state of Israel, the foundational theology of evangelical Christianity, American foreign policy, and the deeply painful ongoing conflicts in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So if you are listening to this, we want you to know emphatically,
Yeah.
we are not taking sides here.
We are entirely neutral ground.
Completely. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we bringing a left-wing or right-wing political agenda to the table.
Right.
Our sole purpose is to impartially break down the arguments, the timeline, and the concepts presented in this document. Think of us as your tour guides through a very complex museum exhibit.
I like that analogy.
We're just showing you what the curator put on the walls,
Yeah.
explaining the history behind the artifacts.
Perfectly framed. So let's walk into the first room of this exhibit.
Let's do it.
The author starts by looking backward, way back to the early Christian church. And the opening argument is that if you were to walk up to a Christian in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century and ask them about Zionism, they would look at you like you were speaking a foreign language.
Entirely.
The concept of an earthly political nation state being central to their it did not exist in their framework.
And to understand why, you have to look at how those early generations of Christians actually read their Bibles.
Right.
Specifically, the Old Testament promises about the land of Israel and the city of Zion. What's fascinating here is if you look at the heavy hitters of the early church figures, like Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr.
These were the guys shaping the early theology.
Exactly. And these were people who often lived under intense Roman persecution.
Right, they weren't in power.
Far from it. So when they read the ancient promises of God restoring Zion, they didn't interpret that as a real estate contract for a patch of dirt in the Levant.
Okay.
They viewed those promises as having been fulfilled spiritually in the person of Christ.
So for them, Zion wasn't a place you could point to on a map or, conquer with an army. It was a symbolic, heavenly Jerusalem.
Precisely. They believed the physical land was almost like a shadow or a prototype.
A shadow of things to come.
Right. And once the reality arrived, which they believed was Jesus,
Yeah.
the shadow was no longer the focal point. You don't stare at the shadow when the person is standing right in front of you.
But that makes a lot of sense.
And this wasn't just some quirky phase the early church went through. This theological continuity lasted for centuries.
Oh yeah, the text mentions Augustine.
Look at Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Rome is literally collapsing around him. The physical world is in absolute chaos.
Barbarians at the gates kind of stuff.
Literally. And he writes his masterpiece, The City of God. He makes this massive philosophical distinction between the earthly city of man, which rises and falls with empires and borders, and the eternal city of God.
Which is completely detached from geography.
Exactly. It's a spiritual reality.
Okay, but even fast forwarding 1,000 years to the Protestant Reformation, you have Martin Luther and John Calvin ripping up the rule book on so many Catholic traditions.
Oh, they changed almost everything.
Right. But they don't touch this.
Nope.
They maintain that the new covenant completely superseded the old in form. The promises of God were universalized for the whole world, not localized to a specific Mediterranean coastline.
So for roughly 1,800 years of church history, the overwhelming mainstream view was that the physical land of Palestine wasn't the theological necessity for God's ultimate plan.
Okay, but obviously that changes because today there are millions of Christians who believe the exact opposite.
Right.
They believe that the physical borders of modern Israel are like the most important theological clock in the universe. So if this wasn't there for 1,800 years, how did it suddenly appear?
That brings us to a massive seismic pivot in the 19th century. And it really revolves around an Anglo-Irish clergyman named John Nelson Darby.
Darby, yeah, he is a fascinating character in all this. He's a guy who gets disillusioned with the institutional Anglican Church in the, 1820s and 30s?
Yep, the 1830s.
He leaves and helps form this radical grassroots movement called the Plymouth Brethren. But what he really invents, or at least crystallizes and popularizes, is a theological framework called dispensationalism.
And dispensationalism is the key that unlocks this entire modern movement.
Break that down for me because it sounds super academic.
Sure. To understand it, imagine looking at all of human history as a series of different management eras, or dispensations.
Okay, like different chapters.
Exactly. Darby argued that God doesn't deal with humanity the same way in every era. So there was an era of innocence in Eden, an era of human government, an era of the Mosaic law, and currently the era of grace.
Got it.
But his most radical innovation was creating a massive, impenetrable wall between two groups of people, Israel and the church.
Wait, hold on. Because historically, didn't the church view itself as grafted into Israel? Like one continuous story?
Yes, historically they viewed it as one continuous tree, but Darby comes along and says, no, these are two completely separate tracks.
Okay.
He taught that national Israel is God's earthly people, and their destiny is an earthly, political, geopolitical kingdom centered in Jerusalem.
And the church?
The church, on the other hand, is God's heavenly people. In Darby's framework, the church is almost an accident of history. He viewed it as a parenthesis.
As a parenthesis, like a pause button.
Exactly like a pause button. Darby argued that because the Jewish people rejected Jesus in the 1st century, God essentially paused the clock on his prophecies for Israel.
Whoa.
Yeah. And he inserted the church era as a temporary parenthesis. And eventually, God will hit play on the Israel clock again to finish the timeline.
That is a staggering way to read history.
It completely changes the narrative.
But wait, for God to hit play on the Israel clock, The church has to be removed from the board, right?
Yes.
Which brings us to the most famous part of Darby's entire system.
The pre-tribulation rapture.
There it is.
Darby heavily promoted the idea that before the end of the world, before a horrific 7-year period of tribulation, true believers would be secretly, instantaneously beamed up to heaven.
Just gone.
Right. The church is removed entirely from the earth so that God can resume his primary geopolitical work with a restored nation of Israel.
It's incredible to think that this concept of the rapture, which is so deeply ingrained in American pop culture, I mean, from the Left Behind movies to bumper stickers saying, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned, was practically unheard of for the first 1,800 years of Christianity.
It's a 19th century British innovation.
It's crazy. But here's the thing. Darby's ideas, as complex and novel as they were, they might have just remained a fringe eccentricity of the Plymouth Brethren if it weren't for another crucial and highly controversial figure who brings this theology across the Atlantic.
C.I. Scofield.
Oh, Cyrus Scofield. The history on this guy is wild.
It really is a bit of a soap opera.
Seriously, before he becomes the father of modern American dispensationalism, he is a lawyer with a profoundly shady past.
To say the least.
The records show he was involved in political corruption in Kansas. He served time in prison for forgery.
He abandoned his wife and children.
Right. And he had absolutely no formal theological training. But he eventually converts, reinvents himself as a minister, and somehow manages to secure backing from some very wealthy elite financiers.
And that financial backing allows him to publish something in 1909 that fundamentally rewrites American religion, the Scofield Reference Bible, published by Oxford University Press.
I really want to drill into the mechanics of this Bible because it's not just a new translation of the original Greek and Hebrew.
No, he used the standard King James Version.
Right. What he changed was the technology of the book itself. He invented a formatting style where he took Darby's dispensationalist, pro-Zionist ideas and put them right on the page as explanatory footnotes.
And think about the psychological impact of that.
Okay.
If you were a farmer in Iowa in 1915, and you buy this beautiful leather-bound Bible from Oxford University Press, you open it up, and there is the sacred divine word of God.
The ultimate authority.
Right. And sitting barely an inch below it, in the exact same typeface, is C.I. Scofield's commentary telling you exactly how to interpret that verse. To the average reader, the footnote carried the same divine authority as the scripture itself. It created an illusion of absolute objectivity.
It's essentially like hard-coding a director's commentary into a movie where you can't turn it off.
That's a great way to put it.
The director is constantly whispering in your ear, telling you what the scene means. I want to look at exactly how Scofield weaponized these footnotes. There's a famous example in the book surrounding Genesis 12.3.
Ah, yes. So
Yeah.
Genesis 12 is the foundational call of Abraham. The text says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you.
And for centuries, Christians read that as a spiritual promise that ultimately culminated in Jesus, right? Who was a descendant of Abraham and who spiritually blessed all nations.
Exactly. But Scofield's footnote completely mechanically alters the trajectory of that verse.
How does he change it?
Scofield's note explicitly states that this verse is a perpetual, binding decree regarding the earthly, physical descendants of Abraham and their literal land.
Okay, so he makes it geopolitical.
He takes a spiritual promise of universal salvation and turns it into a foreign policy mandate. He is telling the reader, modern nations will experience literal, economic, and military blessings or curses from God based entirely on how their governments treat the political entity of Jewish people returning to Palestine.
Wow. He turned theology into a transactional treaty.
Literally.
Support this specific geopolitical movement and God will make your crops grow. Oppose it and God will bankrupt your country.
It's a massive shift.
Monumental. And it leads directly to what the text calls the fig tree mythology.
Right, which is a perfect example of how this hyperliteralism creates modern anxiety.
Break that down.
So in Matthew 24, Jesus is giving a complex teaching about the future. And he says, learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near.
And for 1,000 years, preachers read that as a metaphor, right? Like, hey, pay attention to the spiritual seasons. Be discerning.
Yes, but using Scofield's framework, 20th century Christian Zionists read it as a literal geopolitical cipher. They claimed the fig tree was the specific symbol for the modern state of Israel.
Oh, wow.
So when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine and the state of Israel was founded in 1948, These theologians pointed at the newspaper and said, look, the fig tree is putting forth leaves.
And the math kicks in, because Jesus also says in that same passage, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place.
Exactly.
So they calculated a biblical generation as exactly 40 years. You take 1948, you add 40 years, and you get 1988.
There's that 1988 date again.
They literally set a timer for the apocalypse based on a footnote's interpretation of a metaphor.
It completely transformed biblical prophecy. It was no longer a cosmic message about God's ultimate victory over evil. It became a rigid, terrifying geopolitical calendar.
But having a rigid calendar in a study Bible doesn't automatically mean millions of people are going to care.
No, it doesn't.
To get millions of people to care, you need a marketing engine. How did this incredibly intricate, footnote-heavy theology jump out of seminary classrooms and become the biggest pop culture phenomenon in American religion?
It required a translator. And that translator arrived in 1970 with a man named Hal Lindsey.
How lazy.
He wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth.
Okay, I looked this up. That book sold 35 million copies.
Unbelievable.
To put that in perspective for you listening, that is on par with To Kill a Mockingbird or The Great Gatsby. It was an absolute leviathan in the publishing world.
And Hal Lindsey was a genius at reading the cultural room.
Yeah.
Think about the late 1960s and 1970s. You have the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the Vietnam War, massive cultural upheaval in the U.S.
People were terrified.
Exactly. Lindsey took this dense Scofield Darby dispensationalist timeline and packaged it as a gripping, marketable airport-style thriller.
He essentially told his readers, you aren't just reading the news, you're watching a divine screenplay unfold in real time.
Yes.
And he has assigned specific biblical roles to modern nations, like casting actors in a play.
Exactly. He looked at the book of Ezekiel, which talks about an ancient enemy from the north called Gog and Magog invading Israel. Lindsey explicitly told his millions of readers that Gog and Magog was the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union.
Right. So the Soviet Union wasn't just a communist rival to the United States. They were a demonic, prophesied enemy destined to invade the Middle East and trigger World War III, which would culminate in the Battle of Armageddon.
That is terrifying. It completely shifts the focus of what it means to be a Christian. If you genuinely believe that the Soviet Union is going to invade Israel next Tuesday, and a global nuclear holocaust is predestined by God, your priorities change.
Drastically.
The author argues that this diverted the American church's attention away from the core teachings of Jesus, like the Sermon on the Mount, feeding the poor, seeking systemic justice, and redirected all that energy into what they call rapture survivalism.
Why bother polishing the brass on a sinking ship?
Right.
The goal became entirely about getting people saved so they could escape in the rapture before the Soviet missiles flew.
Which brings us back to that 1988 date. Lindsey heavily implied the rapture would happen in the 1980s, tying right into that 40-year fig tree math.
Yep.
But 1988 arrived. The world didn't end. A few years later, the Soviet Union, the supposed biblical Antichrist empire, completely collapsed without firing a single shot in the Middle East.
A total geopolitical surprise.
Right. So I'm stuck on this. How does a movement whose entire brand is predicting the end of the world survive when their core predictions objectively, demonstrably fail?
It survives through a psychological mechanism that the author calls perpetual imminence.
Perpetual imminence. Okay, explain how that works mechanically.
So in a rational world, a failed apocalyptic prediction shatters the paradigm. People realize they were wrong and move on.
Like a cult that drinks the Kool-Aid when the spaceship doesn't come.
Right. But in dispensationalism, the failure doesn't destroy the system. It just shifts the timeline. When 1988 failed, the leaders didn't say, we misread the Bible. They said, we miscalculated the length of a generation. Biblical generation isn't 40 years, it's 70 or 80 years.
Oh, how convenient.
Right. So the new target instantly becomes 2018 or 2028. Perpetual imminence keeps the audience in a constant, adrenaline-fueled state of fear-driven urgency. The climax is always delayed, just enough to keep you hooked, but close enough to keep you terrified.
It's the ultimate subscription model for anxiety.
That is exactly what it is.
You never lose your audience because the threat is always just around the corner. And this perpetual anxiety was incredibly lucrative, which leads directly into the rise of the megachurch. Pastors like Jerry Falwell and later John Hagee recognized that this wasn't just a theology, it was a brand.
They completely commercialized the apocalypse. If you attended one of these massively influential megachurches at their peak, you wouldn't just hear a sermon. You were participating in an immersive aesthetic experience.
What did that look like?
They draped the stages in massive Israeli flags. They had congregants blowing ancient Jewish shofars during worship. They sang Zion-centric, militaristic music. It was a complete fusion of faith, fear, and finance.
And the finance part is where it gets really dark. The text outlines something called the prosperity twist. Walk me through the mechanics of how a pastor connects Middle Eastern geopolitics to a congregant's personal bank account.
It goes right back to that Scofield footnote on Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you. These pastors took that geopolitical mandate and personalized it. They stood on stage and told thousands of working-class Americans, if you write a check to this Israeli settlement fund, or if you donate to this charity supporting the Israeli Defense Forces, God will miraculously intervene in your personal finances.
Like a divine kickback.
Exactly. You will get that promotion at work. Your medical debt will be cleared. God will bless you financially because you blessed the physical nation of Israel.
It is entirely transactional. It turns the creator of the universe into a vending machine, where the currency is foreign geopolitical donations.
It really does.
But if you step back and look at the sheer scale of this, if you have tens of millions of people who are financially, emotionally, and theologically invested in a specific foreign nation, you don't just have a megachurch anymore.
No, you have a massive, highly motivated, single-issue voting bloc.
And that is exactly what happened. The theology didn't stay in the pews. It moved directly into the halls of power, completely capturing the political machinery.
But the author points out that this political capture actually predates the American megachurch.
Really?
Yeah, it started across the Atlantic with British imperialism.
Okay, let's get into this because this is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Right. In the 19th century, before dispensationalism really took over America, you had elite British evangelicals, men like Lord Shaftesbury.
Who was Lord Shaftesbury?
He was a deeply influential politician and reformer in Britain. And Shaftesbury genuinely believed that facilitating the return of Jewish people to Palestine would hasten the return of Christ.
Okay.
And because he was a wealthy aristocrat, he had the ear of the British Empire. This theological sentiment permeated the British ruling class and heavily influenced the 1917 Balfour Declaration.
Right. And for those who might not remember their World War I history, the Balfour Declaration was a public statement issued by the British government announcing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which Britain was about to conquer from the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. It was a staggering fusion of British colonial ambition and Christian prophetic theology. And that exact pipeline of elite political influence transfers straight over to the United States.
Yeah, the text mentions a really obscure but critical event in 1891 called the Blackstone Memorial. What was that?
William E. Blackstone was an American Christian Zionist. Years before the first Zionist Congress was even convened by Jewish leaders in Europe, Blackstone organized a petition.
A petition for what?
Well, he gathered the signatures of the most powerful men in America. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, numerous congressmen.
Wow. Heavy hitters?
Huge. And he presented this memorial to President Benjamin Harrison. The petition explicitly asked the United States to use its global influence to restore the Jews to Palestine, entirely based on biblical prophetic grounds.
So you have the titans of American capitalism lobbying the White House for Middle Eastern regime change based on their interpretation of biblical prophecy.
Exactly.
And that influence culminates dramatically in 1948 with President Harry Truman. When the State of Israel declares its independence, Truman officially recognizes the new nation just 11 minutes later.
Yep.
Against the advice of his own State Department, I might add.
Truman's diaries and historical accounts show that he was heavily lobbied by Zionist Christians. But it wasn't just political pressure, it was deeply personal for him. Truman later openly compared himself to King Cyrus.
King Cyrus the Great of Persia, the biblical king who conquered Babylon and allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple.
Think about the psychological weight of that. You have the President of the United States, the man who just dropped the atomic bomb, viewing his foreign policy decisions not just through the lens of Cold War strategy,
but viewing himself as an anointed biblical monarch fulfilling ancient prophecy.
Yes, it is a terrifying combination of supreme executive power and religious destiny.
But the real modern political machinery, the organized, weaponized voting bloc, really kicks into high gear in 1979 with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority.
Right. Falwell took this theology and made it a partisan weapon. He explicitly merged conservative American Christianity with right-wing political Zionism.
Because prior to this, evangelicals were politically diverse, right?
Very diverse. But Falwell made support for Israel a rigid moral imperative. He placed it on the exact same level as opposition to abortion or defense of traditional marriage. It became a core tenet of what it meant to be a good conservative Christian.
And the political leaders in Israel absolutely recognized what Falwell was doing, and they rewarded him for it. The text points out an unbelievable detail.
Oh, the Jets.
Yes. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was from the right-wing Likud party, actually gifted Jerry Falwell a private jet.
And the Jabotinsky Medal.
Right. Which, for context for you listening, the Jabotinsky Medal is one of Israel's highest honors. It's named after Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, which was the more militant territorial wing of the movement.
Handing that medal and a private jet to an American evangelical pastor is a massive, incredibly overt statement.
It really is. It is a foreign head of state directly funding and honoring an American religious leader to secure his political lobbying power in Washington.
And Falwell's spiritual successor in this arena is John Hagee, who takes that lobbying power and institutionalizes it in 2006 by founding CUFI, Christians United for Israel.
CUFI is essentially the evangelical equivalent of AIPAC, right? The secular pro-Israel lobbying group.
Yes, but CUFI is arguably much larger. They claim over 10 million members. And we need to understand how they lobby.
Right, it isn't just sending a few emails.
Far from it. They host massive summits in Washington. They bus thousands of highly energized voters to Capitol Hill. They flood congressional switchboards. They draft legislation, push for massive, unconditional military aid packages, and aggressively campaign for anti-boycott laws at the state and federal level.
And all of that organized power reaches its absolute zenith during the Trump presidency. In 2017, the United States takes the highly controversial step of officially moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel.
Which was a move that previous presidents of both parties had delayed for decades. Because it essentially torpedoed the peace process by pre-deciding one of the most sensitive issues in the conflict. But the Trump administration did it. And look at the optics of the ceremony.
Oh, the ceremony was wild.
It wasn't just diplomats cutting a ribbon. It was celebrated with fervent apocalyptic prayers by evangelical leaders like Robert Jeffress and John Hagee.
They framed a diplomatic maneuver as a divine prophetic decree.
Completely.
Okay, I want to pause and look at how this specific 19th century theological interpretation managed to completely rewrite the actual party platforms of the two major American political parties. Because it did.
It absolutely did. If you look at the Republican Party, the author provides a brilliant breakdown of how their platform evolved. The concept of one nation under God, which used to just be a generic Cold War patriotic slogan, was elevated into a literal covenantal alliance with the State of Israel.
In 2016, the Republican National Committee actually removed the language supporting a two-state solution from their official party platform. They stripped away the goal of an independent Palestinian state.
Because, for the Christian Zionist voting base, dividing the land of Israel is seen as a direct violation of God's biblical borders. The text argues that unquestioning support for right-wing Israeli policies became a non-negotiable litmus test for Republican candidates.
If you want to survive a GOP primary, you must demonstrate total fealty to this theology.
Exactly.
And what about the Democrats? The text talks about the Democratic dilemma. How are they trapped in this?
It's a brutal paralysis. The Democratic Party has historically enjoyed strong, reliable support from secular and moderately religious Jewish American voters. But modern Democratic politicians find themselves caught in a vice grip.
Explain the grip.
On one side, centrist Democrats are heavily pressured by these massive evangelical and pro-Israel lobbying groups like CUFI and AIPAC, who hold immense fundraising power.
Okay, and the other side?
On the other side, the progressive wing of the Democratic base, particularly younger voters, is increasingly demanding accountability for Palestinian human rights and an end to unconditional military aid.
So they're stuck.
The result is a bipartisan paralysis where theological absolutism from the right makes nuanced, pragmatic diplomacy nearly impossible.
And the real-world consequences of this paralysis are catastrophic. The source illustrates this by looking at how recent American wars were framed by this theology. Look at the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Oh, absolutely.
You had prominent evangelical leaders going on television and justifying the shock and awe bombing of Baghdad as Babylon falling. They were framing a geopolitical war for oil and influence as the fulfillment of the book of Revelation.
And look at the fierce, almost hysterical opposition to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The resistance wasn't just about the technical details of uranium enrichment.
No.
It was driven by the deep-seated prophetic view that modern-day Iran is the biblical Persia or Gog from Ezekiel. They're viewed as an apocalyptic enemy predestined to trigger the end of the world.
Right. When you view a foreign nation not as a rational geopolitical actor with whom you can negotiate, but as an eternal biblical demon, diplomacy isn't just difficult, it is viewed as actual treason against God.
You can't sign a peace treaty with a dragon from the book of Revelation.
That is such a good way to put it. You can't. And this brings up the most glaring, painful blind spot in this entire theology.
The human cost.
Exactly. All these grand geopolitical chess moves, the embassy relocations, the multi-billion-dollar weapon shipments, the prophecy charts mapping out the end of the world, they completely, conveniently ignore the actual human beings living on the board. What happens to the millions of people who don't neatly fit into a 19th century dispensationalist prophecy?
This is where the critique pivots from historical analysis to a deeply human tragedy. Because in its absolute zeal to unconditionally support the state of Israel, Christian Zionism has effectively erased an entire demographic of people from the narrative.
Palestinian Christians.
It is one of the most astounding cognitive dissonances in modern religion. We are talking about the direct, physical descendants of the first century church.
Right. These are people whose ancestors were baptized in the Jordan River centuries before America was even a concept.
Yeah.
People living in Bethlehem, Ramallah, Jerusalem, Gaza.
But because their mere existence as indigenous Arab Christians complicates the neat, binary Zionist narrative, they are utterly ignored. Or worse, treated as politically suspect by Western evangelicals.
The author describes this phenomenon of the Bethlehem tourist bubble, which perfectly captures the madness of it all.
It's so surreal.
It is. Every single year, thousands of American evangelical pilgrims travel to the Holy Land. They want to walk where Jesus walked, so they visit Bethlehem to see the Church of the Nativity. But think about how they actually experience it.
Right. They arrive in heavily armored, air-conditioned tour buses. They get off the bus, take smiling selfies next to the manger where the Prince of Peace was allegedly born, buy an olive wood cross, get back on the bus, and leave.
It is an entirely curated, sterilized experience.
It's essentially like taking a smiling selfie inside a historic museum while completely ignoring the fact that the museum staff, the actual caretakers of the building, are trapped inside a burning room right behind you.
That captures it perfectly, because to maintain that happy tourist bubble, those pilgrims have to aggressively ignore the realities surrounding them. They have to ignore the 8-meter-high, gray, concrete separation wall that chokes the city of Bethlehem.
They have to ignore the heavily armed military checkpoints that take locals hours to cross just to get to work or the hospital.
Right. They have to ignore the local Christian merchants, their own brothers and sisters in the faith, whose economy and dignity are being suffocated by a decades-long military occupation. They want the spiritual high of Bethlehem without having to look at the very real cross the locals are currently bearing.
And if Bethlehem is a slow suffocation, the situation in Gaza is an acute nightmare.
Yeah, the text gets into Gaza.
The text points out moments when Christian institutions in Gaza, like the Al-Ali Arab Hospital, an Anglican institution, are bombed by the Israeli military. And the response from the massive Western evangelical establishment.
Total silence.
The author makes a chilling argument here. For many hardline Christian Zionists, the civilian deaths of Palestinians, even the deaths of fellow Christians, are internalized as acceptable collateral damage.
Because it fits the prophecy.
Yes. If the expansion and security of the Israeli state is a divine mandate, then anyone who stands in the way or simply happens to live on the wrong side of the border is an obstacle to God's plan.
It's not just happening in the occupied territories either. Even Christian Arabs living inside Israel's 1948 borders, people who technically hold Israeli citizenship, are increasingly marginalized. The text points specifically to the 2018 nation-state law passed by the Israeli Knesset.
The 2018 nation-state law is a critical piece of legislation. It formally declared that the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people.
Unique to them alone.
Right. It downgraded the status of the Arabic language and explicitly directed the state to encourage and promote Jewish settlement as a national value. For the 20% of Israel's population who are Arab, including Christian Arabs, it legally institutionalized their status as second-class citizens in their own homeland.
And American Christian Zionists cheered for it, which forces a really uncomfortable question, one that Tony Yustein presses extremely hard in this book. How can a theological movement claim to follow Jesus Christ, who commanded his followers to love their neighbors and care for the oppressed, while simultaneously ignoring, defending, or even financially underwriting the suffering of Christ's direct descendants in his own homeland?
The author's conclusion is devastating. He writes that Christian Zionism elevates land theology over cruciform love.
Wow. Land theology over cruciform love.
They care more about who holds the deed to the dirt than they care about the human beings bleeding into it. It is a profound, fundamental theological contradiction.
And that stark contradiction forces us to rip the Band-Aid off and look back at the actual source code of the religion, the words of Jesus himself. If this political machinery is producing this kind of suffering, how does it actually square with the Bible?
That brings us to the core theological critique of the book. The author argues that Christian Zionism hasn't just misinterpreted Jesus, it has fundamentally inverted him. The text starts with a very basic historical reality that often gets lost in modern politics.
Right.
Jesus was not a settler.
Right. If you look at the historical Jesus of Nazareth, he wasn't a landowning conqueror. He wasn't a general. He was a marginalized, colonized Jew living under the brutal, suffocating military occupation of the Roman Empire.
Exactly. He knew what checkpoints and military brutality looked like.
And during his 3 years of public ministry, he had every opportunity to embrace a violent nationalist theology. The people wanted it.
Oh, they desperately wanted it. He was constantly pressured by the Zealots.
Which was a heavily armed, radical Jewish faction that wanted a violent holy war to overthrow the Romans and reclaim the land for God.
But Jesus actively, repeatedly rejected them.
There is that moment in the Gospel of John, chapter 6. Jesus performs a miracle, feeding the 5,000, and the crowd gets so whipped up into a nationalistic frenzy that they decide they are going to take him by force and make him their political, earthly king.
And what does he do? He doesn't raise an army. He literally flees to the mountains by himself.
He actively subverts and rejects the exact kind of earthly geopolitical kingship that Christian Zionists are trying to force upon him today.
If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7, it is essentially the constitution of Jesus' movement, and it reads like a direct refutation of Zionist ethics. Jesus stands up and blesses the peacemakers. He blesses the meek, promising that they will inherit the earth. He commands his followers to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them. He conspicuously does not bless the militarized, the powerful, the conquerors, or the people who build the tallest walls.
Yustein argues that Christian Zionism isn't the gospel of Jesus, it is the gospel of empire. He compares it to the Constantinian shift.
Right. The Constantinian shift of 313 AD is the moment the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized and co-opted Christianity.
Right. Before Constantine, the cross was an instrument of state terror used to execute poor dissidents.
After Constantine, the cross literally became a symbol painted on the shields of Roman soldiers as they marched into battle. The religion flipped from being a critique of empire to the mascot of empire.
When faith blesses the power of the state rather than liberating the poor. But I know someone listening to this right now is mentally pushing back.
Oh, for sure.
They're saying, okay, yes, Jesus preached peace in the New Testament, but you can't just ignore the first 2/3 of the Bible. Doesn't the Old Testament explicitly, repeatedly promise the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants forever? How does the text handle the hard hermeneutics of the Abrahamic covenant?
If you're listening and screaming, but what about the promise to Abraham? Yustein actually tackles that head on. He dives deep into the biblical mechanics of the covenants. His argument is that the Abrahamic covenant was never about exclusive eternal real estate for one ethnic group. If you read Genesis carefully, the promise of the land is inextricably tied to a mission. Abraham was called to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth.
Right.
The New Testament writers, particularly the Apostle Paul, argued that this universal blessing culminated in Christ. The land was just a temporary staging ground for a global rescue mission.
And what about the Mosaic covenant, the laws given to Moses on Mount Sinai?
The author points to the book of Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 28, to show that the Mosaic covenant regarding the land was highly rigorously conditional.
Conditional.
Yes. God says, here is the land, but if you oppress the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant, the land will literally vomit you out. The threat of exile for injustice was built into the contract.
So it wasn't a blank check.
Exactly. The land was never an unconditional, eternal blank check for a modern secular state to do whatever it wants without moral accountability.
Furthermore, Yustein argues that the New Testament completely spiritualizes the concept of the land. In the teachings of Jesus, the true inheritance isn't a 200-mile strip of contested territory in the Middle East. The true inheritance is the kingdom of God, which is a borderless, universal reality of justice and peace.
The author uses a brilliant illustrative example from the temptation of Christ in the wilderness to drive this home.
Oh, yeah.
In the Gospels, Satan takes Jesus up to a high mountain and offers him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. Satan offers Jesus ultimate geopolitical power, absolute territorial dominion.
And Jesus flatly refuses.
He chooses the path of suffering and the cross instead. The author's devastating conclusion is that Christian Zionism has essentially accepted the very temptation that Jesus rejected. They traded the cross of sacrifice for the crown of worldly political dominion.
Wrapping nationalism in sacred text is the ultimate idolatry. But one of the most vital points Yustein makes in the final chapters of the book is that this temptation, this urge to wrap a flag around a holy book to justify violence and land grabs, is absolutely not exclusive to American evangelicals or the modern state of Israel. This is a deeply human sickness.
He calls it a global syndrome of sacred nationalism, and he outlines how the specific ideological DNA of Zionism, the fusion of blood, soil, and divine mandate, has replicated globally across entirely different religions, cultures, and continents.
Let's walk through the different phases of this syndrome because it really opens up the scope of the problem. He starts by looking at secular and Jewish Zionism itself.
It's important to remember that Theodor Herzl, the founding father of modern Zionism in the late 19th century, was a highly assimilated, secular European Jew.
He wasn't trying to fulfill prophecy.
Exactly. His original project wasn't about fulfilling biblical prophecy. It was a desperate, pragmatic search for physical safety for Jewish people facing horrific European anti-Semitism. But the text argues that once the state was actually established, this secular project evolved.
The state itself became an idol.
Yes. The machinery of the nation, the military, the borders, the intelligence agencies became the new golden calf.
And the human cost of that idolatry was massive. Yustein points to what he calls Nakba amnesia. The Nakba, meaning the catastrophe, refers to the 1948 war when roughly 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes to create the State of Israel. For the state to maintain its myth of purity, it has to intentionally, systemically erase the memory of that ethnic cleansing.
Right, and the author also points out the deep internal racism within the movement, to the historic marginalization of non-European Jews. Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East and Ethiopian Jews have faced severe systemic discrimination within Israel because they don't fit the European Ashkenazi vision of the state.
So you have the idolization of the state on one side, but then the text holds up a mirror and points to the exact same mechanics operating on the other side, Muslim Zionism.
Yes, groups like Hamas.
Right. While Hamas is locked in a brutal existential war against Israeli Zionism, the author argues that structurally they utilize the exact same theological logic.
They do. Hamas claims an eternal divine Islamic mandate over the exact same stretch of land. In their charter, all of historic Palestine is an Islamic waqf, an endowment from God.
Therefore, any permanent political compromise or division of the land isn't just a bad treaty, it is religious blasphemy.
It is territorial absolutism cloaked in the Quran, mirroring the territorial absolutism cloaked in the Torah.
The exact same venom, just a different holy book. But the text proves this is a global virus by taking us entirely out of the Middle East and looking at India. Talk to me about Hindu Zionism.
This is a terrifyingly under-discussed parallel. In India, you have the rise of the Hindutva movement, championed by right-wing organizations like the RSS and the current ruling BJP party. Their core ideology is that to be truly Indian is to be Hindu.
They mythologize the physical soil of the Indian subcontinent as sacred, exclusive Hindu territory.
Exactly. And we've seen this result in massive violence. The text uses the example of Ayodhya in 1992. Hindu extremists formed a massive mob and physically tore down the historic, centuries-old Babri Mosque using pickaxes in their bare hands.
Because they claimed it was built on the exact birthplace of the Hindu deity Lord Ram. They wanted to reclaim the sacred soil. The resulting riots killed thousands.
It is the exact same DNA. And the Hindutva movement treats Indian Muslims and Christians not as equal citizens, but as foreign contaminants, spiritual invaders polluting the Holy Land.
And then the author brings the mirror right back home to the United States to look at domestic Christian nationalism. They use the exact same Zionist logic to claim that America has a special covenantal relationship with God.
That America is the promised land. destined for a specific demographic, usually white conservative Christians.
And we saw the violent culmination of this ideology on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol.
We did.
Wait, let me push back on this connection because I think a lot of people struggle to see the link. We all saw the footage of the January 6th riot. We saw the QAnon shirts, the tactical gear, the violence against police. But we also saw rioters carrying giant wooden crosses, holding up Jesus Saves banners, and literally blowing Jewish shofars on the steps of the Capitol.
Which is such a bizarre visual.
Right. What does a riot in Washington, D.C. about a stolen American election have to do with the theology of Israel?
Yustein calls January 6th the prime example of Zionist mimicry. It is the profound, internalized belief that God anoints a specific political leader, whether that's King David or Donald Trump, and that if the nation is slipping away from its perceived divine destiny, then violence, intimidation, and the violent subversion of a democratic election are entirely justified.
So the riot was an attempt to forcefully secure God's chosen boundaries and leaders.
It's the belief that the nation-state itself is sacred, the political outsider is spiritually evil, and true faith requires political dominion.
Yustein steps back and looks at all of these movements, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Christian nationalism, and compares them to the ancient story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis. It's humanity, terrified of its own insecurity, trying to build a fortress that reaches to heaven through political and military dominance.
And just like in the biblical story, it always ends the exact same way, in confusion, division, catastrophic violence, and the collapse of the tower.
And the terrifying part is that this American brand of Christian Zionism is actively being exported around the world like a franchise.
Yeah, the text details how it's moving globally. Look at Guatemala. They moved their embassy to Jerusalem shortly after the U.S. did, heavily driven by their massive, politically active evangelical population.
Look at Brazil under former President Jair Bolsonaro. You had right-wing political rallies where his supporters were waving massive Israeli flags. Megachurches in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Korea are all adopting this Darby Scofield theology. It has become a massive transnational theological empire.
It's staggering when you try to comprehend the sheer scale of the mechanics at play here.
Let's take a breath and recap the massive journey we've taken through this deep dive.
It's been a lot.
We started in the dusty theology of the 19th century with an Irish clergyman named John Nelson Darby inventing a system that ripped the church and Israel apart and introduced the fear of a secret rapture. We saw how a con-man turned pastor named C.I. Scofield took those ideas and hard-coded them into the footnotes of the Bible itself.
Literally rewiring how millions of people read the ancient promises made to Abraham.
We tracked how that footnote theology exploded into a pop culture juggernaut through Hal Lindsey's apocalyptic Cold War thrillers, terrifying a generation with visions of Soviet invasions.
And then we saw it mutate into a highly weaponized political machine through Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, and John Hagee's CUFI lobbying group.
A lobbying machine so powerful it fundamentally altered the platforms of both the Republican and Democratic parties, shaped the justifications for wars in the Middle East, and culminated in the historic move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
And all of this was done while completely erasing the existence, the humanity, and the suffering of Palestinian Christians living behind 8-meter concrete walls in Bethlehem and enduring relentless bombings in Gaza.
The core thesis of Tony Yustein's text is inescapable. Christian Zionism has traded the Beatitudes of Jesus for bulldozers.
That's the tragic summary.
It has swapped the self-sacrificing cross of Christ for the violent crown of Caesar. It took a gospel that was specifically designed to liberate the oppressed and weaponized it to bless an empire.
It is an incredibly heavy, devastating critique of modern religion and politics.
But as we wrap up our time today, I want to step outside the text for just a second. Based on everything we've unpacked, the centuries of history, the political maneuvering, the bloodshed caused by tying the creator of the universe to a specific piece of dirt, where does this leave us? What is the ultimate takeaway?
I think exploring this history leaves us with a profound, incredibly uncomfortable question to mull over. We've seen how deeply wired the human instinct is to claim physical territory, to draw rigid maps, to build walls, and to demand political dominance, and then to stamp God's name on our violence to justify it.
Yeah.
But if the kingdom of God, as Jesus described it, is actually real, what would a truly stateless or borderless spirituality look like today?
That is a paradigm-shattering thought.
We live in an era where every single inch of the globe is mapped by satellites, surveilled by drones, and fought over with weapons of mass destruction. In a world utterly obsessed with borders and control, could the most radical, subversive spiritual act be to completely untether our concept of God from the concept of the nation-state?
To actually believe in a God who doesn't need a flag, a military, or a passport.
Exactly.
It brings us right back to the map we started with. We rely on those maps because they make us feel safe. We want the lines to be permanent. We desperately want to point at a piece of dirt and say, God is here and he is not over there. Because if God is over there with our enemies, that terrifies us.
It does.
But maybe the map itself is the idol. Maybe the borders we draw, the walls we build, and the theologies we invent to justify them are the very things keeping us from seeing the reality that Jesus preached. That the kingdom is already among us, and it belongs to the peacemakers.
Something to really sit with.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. As always, keep exploring, keep questioning the maps you've been handed, and keep learning. We'll see you next time.